So I saw it as my duty to share true monotheism with Christians who didn't realize they were polytheists. That's how I felt. And so I would share Islam with whoever would listen. The first time I encountered a Christian who actually was prepared with answers to these kinds of questions was in college. His name was David. I met him on a debate tournament. I had joined the debate team, he had joined the debate team, and we were going for our first tournament. When we got to the hotel, the rest of the team went out. Some of them had brought drugs with them. Some of them were looking to hook up for the night and do all kinds of stuff. The team all went out to do their thing. My mom had taught me, hey, don't do that kind of stuff. Be above that. And so I stayed back. And there was one other guy on the team who said, I don't want to be a part of that either. And he stayed back. And I thought, okay, well, I can actually see eye to eye with this guy. And so we had to share rooms anyway. So we ended up rooming together that night. And as I'm putting my stuff away, he pulls out a Bible and starts reading. I'm thinking, no way, this guy's a Christian. This will be fun. And so I looked at him and I said, David, you realize that book you're reading is not trustworthy. And he closes the Bible and says, go on. So you guys are aware, I missed it. I was in the moment. I was just going to take him down. It's like, David, think about it. Didn't Jesus speak Aramaic? But the earliest New Testament was written in Greek. And so by the time you actually have a recording of what Jesus said, it's already gone through a translation. But the Bible that lasted the longest period of time in church history was the Latin Bible, and so it goes through another translation. And then from Latin, it went to German before it came to English, so you had another translation of a translation. So you've got a translation of a translation of a translation of a translation is what you're reading. How do I know that I'm actually reading Jesus' words when it's been translated so many times? Now, I had used that challenge on Christians before, but what I didn't know about David is that he had been raised an atheist. 5 years prior, he had seen his friend Randy reading a Bible, and he had challenged Randy. He said, Randy, do you know why you're reading a Bible? Because you were born in America. Had you been born in India, you'd be reading the Vedas. Had you been born in Arabia, you'd be reading a Quran. Had you been born somewhere else, you'd be reading something else because people like you just believe what you're taught to believe. A bit condescending. The irony is David was just saying that because he was raised atheist, but whatever, it's fine. Randy systematically dismantles David's arguments. He starts explaining to him why the scriptures are reliable, why he trusts in the gospel, starts giving him evidence for his faith. Over the course of the year, David slowly begins to realize that the Christian message is true. And then he spends the next 4 years doing nothing but studying how to defend the gospel. And then I walked into the room. And in fact, David had been praying all that morning. He had been saying, God, there's a Muslim on the team. If you want me to share the gospel with him, just open the door. And I just walked right through the door. I was like, hey, I'm here. And so David says, Nabeel, earlier today, I heard you speaking on the phone with your mom. Were you speaking in English? I said, no. And he said, but then I asked you what you talked about with your mom, and you told me in English. Was that a bad translation? No. He said, Nabeel, you're multilingual. You can take what you hear in one language and accurately translate that message into another language, and so were the disciples. Whatever language Jesus was speaking, yes, he spoke Aramaic, but he could have been speaking Greek. Whatever language he was speaking, the disciples heard it, wrote it down in Greek, and we have in our possession today over 5,000 manuscripts of the New Testament in the original Greek. Nabeel, we know with certainty what Jesus said. I said, David, I think you're making this up. I've talked to hundreds of Christians. No one's told me this before. He says, you think I'm making this up? I'm like, yeah, I think you're making this up. He says, well, bring it. I said, it's been brought. Let's go. And so for the rest of the night, I just challenge him, argument after argument. I'm like, what do you mean Jesus died for the sins of mankind? How does one man's death pay for everybody's sins? What do you mean that God is a Trinity? How can three be one? What do you mean? And I would just challenge him on all these basic principles of Christianity. And for the first time, someone had thought about it and was actually giving me responses that began to make sense. Although I wasn't done challenging. It's not like I just believed him the moment he gave me a response. So I challenged, we pushed and pulled. He started pushing on Islam a bit, and I started pushing back. And so we're going back and forth. By the end of the weekend, we're nowhere near done with arguing, so we decide to go back to our university and sign up for courses so that we can sit in the back of the lecture hall and argue with one another. And in the middle of that, we end up doing projects together. We end up doing homework together. He starts coming to my house, and my mom makes him biryani and korma and roti and makhni. And then I go to his house, and his dad gives me beef jerky. I was like, okay, that's fine, whatever, cool. And so in the course of all this, going to each other's house, living life together, we actually became best friends. I realized that David was my best friend. And if you have a message like the gospel, and you're sharing that with a Muslim, you're basically asking them to give up their lives. You're asking them to give up everything. If they don't know they can trust you, they're not going to hear what you have to say. Relationships are critical for sharing the gospel. I'm not saying street preaching doesn't work. It does work. I do it. But that's not the primary mode God has intended for us to reach the world. It's through love and relationships. And so my friend David, after sharing arguments with me over the course of a year, it actually took a year to discuss the reliability of the New Testament, I began to conclude, hey, this book is actually reliable. There's no way that the New Testament, because of the way it was written and proliferated, there's no way anybody could have come and intentionally altered it such that it wouldn't have been caught. I wish I had time to go into the details, but there was no method of external control over the Scripture like that. It proliferated much more organically. And so I said, okay, the New Testament's reliable, but does that mean Christianity's true? No, it doesn't. How do I know whether Christianity is actually true or not? And so for the next few years, we embarked on an investigation into the evidence of Christianity versus the evidence of Islam. I was trying to convert him to Islam. He's trying to convert me to Christianity. And we would just share the arguments. Now, you might be saying, what do you mean evidence for a faith? Don't you just pick a faith based on what appeals to you? And I would say, no, there's so many different faiths out there. You've got Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism. You've got, of course, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, the big three monotheistic faiths. All these different faiths appeal to different people. Usually, the faith you were raised in appeals to you more than every other faith does. But that doesn't make the faith true. What makes a faith true and what makes it false? Interestingly, the Christian message stands or falls on the resurrection of Jesus. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, if Christ is not risen, our faith is in vain, and we're of all people most to be pitied. So did Jesus actually rise from the dead? And, very important for a Muslim as well, is Jesus God? Did he claim to be God or not? And we find the two brought together in Romans chapter 10, verse 9. If you confess with your mouth, some of you might know this verse, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Pastor Matthew, they passed the Bible test. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Okay, Jesus is God, he died on the cross, and he rose from the dead. These three components actually form the gospel message. I'm not sure if you've heard the gospel before, but here's what it is in a nutshell. God himself, after having created us, knew that we would rebel against him, and indeed, we all rebel against him. And the penalty for separating ourselves from God like that is death. And you might say, why would God kill you for sin? That's a bit extreme. No, God doesn't kill you for sin. When you sin, you remove yourself from the source of life. When you rebel against God, you're looking at the source of life and saying, I'm walking away from you. And so you incur death for yourself. God enters into this world, dies on our behalf so that we don't have to die and be separated from him. And then he rises from the dead to prove that death has been defeated and to show us what will happen to us. We will rise from the dead one day and be with him. That's the gospel message.